Welcome to another episode of Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders for coders about all aspects of creating your best life as a developer.
I'm Will, the accomplished developer and aspiring software architect.
And I'm Beej, the journeyman developer, sharing my journey in development.
Complete Developer Podcast is supported by listeners like you. We are now on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CompleteDeveloperPodcast.
Progressive web apps are websites with a look and feel of a native application. Even better, they have similar functionality to native apps. In a mobile-first, device-heavy world, this allows us to build web applications that are able to access the native features of the device while running an application via the web. These features can include offline functioning, notifications, and app caching. This week, we've brought Doug Parker on to talk to us about building Google Bulletin, a progressive web app. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
I've been fighting the introvert hangover that happens every time I go to a conference and stand around for 3 days talking to people. Like I turn into a cranky old man when I get home and then just like seclude myself for a while. And that's pretty much what I'm doing. Not really fighting much of anything other than just hoping the doorbell doesn't ring.
You were starting to get that way the last day of the conference too, man. I could tell.
Yeah, I know.
You. So, Doug, how about you?
Well, I mean, a couple weeks ago I was sick, and I'm still kind of recovering from that, trying to do all the stuff that I put off while I was sick. But from a development standpoint, the last week I spent trying to working on our web app, trying to reduce our usage of large blobs that we have to deal with in memory to try and improve the performance of our app. Fighting through that so that we reduce our memory usage enough that Safari stops crashing for us, which has been a lot of fun. So I would definitely call that a fight.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like it.
Yeah.
Anytime you have to deal with Safari is a fight. So I am still recovering from Music City Tech as well. I didn't get an introvert hangover like Will because I am very extroverted. I did, however, get sick, so I'm more like Doug in that aspect. I caught some kind of bug while I was at the conference, and I was out of commission all day Sunday and Monday after the conference. You know you're sick when you can't even work from home. Because I work from home on Mondays, and it was that bad. We didn't get to record or anything last week, but we made up for it Saturday with 2 episodes. Speaking of which, Saturday was a mess. I left here from Will's house because I was having my bike picked up to fix the front tire. Originally, I'd scheduled them to come pick it up on Monday, but they called me back and couldn't. So I was like, all right, be there at 1 on Saturday, and I can get there in time. 1:15, they hadn't shown up. Apparently, one of the sales guys had taken the truck without notification. So I was like, I called him up. I told him, hey, I have to be somewhere at 2. And they showed up at 10 till 2 and picked the bike up. So we're good to go. I do think someone needs to build an app, maybe a progressive web app, to help places track their tow trucks. But since we're talking about progressive web apps today, I found a fun tutorial for building IoT projects with a PWA. This tutorial from another Google developer uses Web Bluetooth, which allows you to control Bluetooth low energy BLE devices such as appliances, sensors, and monitors via the web. Basically, it connects the Bluetooth network to the web. This will allow one application across multiple device types and platforms. The tutorial is really interesting and goes on to show how to control BLE IoT devices from your browser, but doesn't stop there. To get that native feel that we all know and love of having an app downloaded on your control device, be it phone, tablet, or whatever, it goes through how to build a progressive web app for controlling your devices. It's a really interesting combination of progressive web apps in the IoT world. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. Will, who's talking to us this week?
Well, grabbed a comment on the OWASP Top 10 by Britchens. Says your XSS discussion reminded me a lot of an article on injecting malicious code into NPM. There's some good reasons to minimize the features and dependencies you allow on a site. And then he gave us a link to a article from hackernoon.com that we'll link in the show notes.
Rich, and that's really awesome. Thank you so much for that comment. Send us an email to neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com with your contact information, because we've got a Complete Developer water bottle just for you. Guys, if you'd like your very own Complete Developer water bottle, leave us a review in iTunes or comment on the website or any of our social media. We post all our episodes to Google+, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and we're also on Instagram, Path, and Tumblr. You can check us out each week where we do a live session talking about what's going on in the tech world and answering listener questions. Or join the conversation anytime via Slack by going to slack.completedevelopernetwork.com.
Doug Parker is a web developer with Google focusing on HTML, JavaScript, and CSS with Polymer. He is currently working on Bulletin, a progressive web app which enables users to tell the untold stories of their communities by creating these stories in an impactful, open, and effortless way. In his spare time, he plays a lot of video games and works on some personal development projects for fun.
Doug, thanks for coming on the show. One of the questions that we like to ask all of our guests is, how did you first get involved with development or become interested in technology?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So you already mentioned that I play a lot of video games, and as a kid growing up, I got that habit very young. My brother's fault, blame him. But throughout school, I was always strong in math and science. But one day in junior high, I was in an advanced math class, and suddenly a group of high school students from just my local high school came in, and they were talking about what they called the Global Information Technology Academy. It was effectively a 4-year computer science program at the high school, kind of a STEM program based around computer programming. And so some of the students demoed a lot of the projects that they had been working on. And not to mention that throughout the 4 years, the last project you do for every year was to basically just make something cool and interesting, which for a lot of people became video games. So they were demoing video games that they had built as part of this program. And that just blew me away. I certainly knew that there were people who made these video games, but it had never really occurred to me that that was something that I could do. So I ended up joining that program, and I was in it throughout all of high school, made a lot of really cool programs and a lot of different things, but primarily in video games. That was the thing that I was really interested in. That got me into software development, and I continued that on into college and have kind of kept that going. Not so much doing video games anymore, but at least just the general software development industry, which is the thing that really hooked me.
I gotta say, I'm jealous of a 4-year programming course, because I got to do 3 years in high school only because my senior year they changed the classes they were teaching from, this is aging myself here, but QBasic and Turbo Pascal to VB and C++. So I got to pick a third language to learn because I just happened to be there when they made that transition. So that's, like I said, I'm jealous. A lot of my friends really were fascinated with the game development and stuff like that. So I understand it.
Yeah, it was a very rare kind of program. You don't see those things in a lot of high schools. I remember showing up first day of college and asking some of the other people what their experience was, and they had maybe 1 year of like AP Comp Sci or something, but nobody had the experience or background that I had as a result of that. So I'm really grateful to that program, and it's definitely gotten me to where I am today.
That's really awesome, man. So we've been participating in the trial for Google Bulletin here in Nashville. It was really exciting. Will wasn't able to make it, but I got to go out to, I guess it was the launch party, whatever, at the Google Fiber office, and ran into a lot of the other organizers and event people that we know here in town, and got to meet some new ones. It was a really awesome event. And then when we found out what it was for, I was like, oh, this is great. I'm going to so use this all the time. And then I found out that, it's hard to use on iPhone. So, had to wait a little bit to get to it, but I have been using it and really enjoying it. Doug, could you explain to our listeners what Google Bulletin is and a little bit about it?
Well, I'm glad to hear you guys are excited about it. Essentially, Bulletin is a tool for publishing stories about your local community directly to the web in an impactful, open, and effortless way. Essentially, a user of Bulletin can capture text, photos, or videos about a local event that they happen to be at, and then publish them to the web at a publicly visible URL. These stories they get indexed by search engines. They're publicly available, not trapped in any kind of walled garden. They're easily shareable to whatever online communities you happen to be a part of. Currently, we're in limited pilot in Nashville, where you guys are, and also in Oakland. And we're still kind of working out the kinks of this, still in the early stages, trying to figure out how to solve a lot of these problems and really make something that lets users tell these kind of untold stories, all these different events happening nearby that just don't end up on the web in the same way that a national or global event often is. We've seen a lot of people pick this up at, say, high school sporting events, for instance. Mm-hmm. A national sporting event that gets televised, everybody knows what that is, but your local high school, you can't Google the scores of your latest high school football game. But with something like Bulletin, we're hoping that parents can actually tell these stories and show some of the amazing things that happen at these kinds of events.
Oh yeah, I know. We had another one of your developers come in and talk to the meetup group that we run. But what's really funny is I had run to the store to pick up some supplies, and on the way home, I saw some tents and stuff being set up in one of the small parks over in the neighborhood near me. And so I drove over to see what it was, and it was this maker fair. Apparently, their semi-annual maker fair where people come in from all over the state and just set up in this one little bitty park here in Bellevue. So I got my phone out and I was like, hey, this would be a great time to practice some Google Bulletin since I'm about to go learn more about it. And just went around and took pictures and talked to people. It was really cool. I think what you guys are doing with that is really awesome. So next, what is a progressive web app? And why did Google choose to build Bulletin as one?
So if you try to do a Google search for progressive web app, you're honestly not going to find a whole lot that's really useful. There's a lot of vague and unhelpful definitions, which I think is really funny. But my favorite definition of what a PWA is, it comes from Alex Russell, who's an engineer on the Chrome team who is heavily involved in progressive web apps. And he defined them as just websites that took all the right vitamins, which is equally vague and unhelpful, I think, but it kind of gets the point across that a PWA isn't so much a category. There's not a whole lot of like, this is a PWA, this isn't a PWA. Really, what PWAs are is they're a methodology. They're a set of principles for websites and web applications to abide by. Simply by following those principles, you can take advantage of what being a progressive web app is.
So it's not Google's technology so much as it is just the right way to do it.
Yeah, you could think of it as that, as just like the kind of the best practices for a website or web application, and simply ideas and principles to follow when developing things. There are three core tenets to what progressive web apps are. Mainly, that progressive web apps should be reliable. They should work in poor network conditions or entirely offline. That's something that websites traditionally have had trouble with in the past. Effectively, we're trying to get rid of the dinosaur in Chrome, right? When you try to go somewhere and you're just not connected and you get the little dinosaur screen, you play the silly little endless runner game. Effectively, we're trying to get rid of that, right? You should always be able to get to these kinds of sites and applications because they should be able to work in these poor network conditions or entirely offline. The second major tenet is just being fast. The interface of a progressive web app should be smooth. It shouldn't be janky and have awkward scrolling. When you press a button, you shouldn't have to wait for a network request before it actually is able to load and show you something. I think I've seen a statistic somewhere that 53% of users will abandon a site if it takes more than 3 seconds to load.
Yeah, I've seen something pretty similar to that in e-commerce before. And I saw a breakdown a while back, like where somebody made the site a certain percentage slower, and they, compared that to the loss in revenue, which, probably just about got them fired, but it's scary.
I think I heard something similar where I believe it was Walmart was focusing on increasing performance on their site, and as the page load time decreased, their revenue went up, simply because people were more willing to spend more time on the site and browse more things and commit more to that site. And their revenue had a very positive impact from that.
That makes a lot of sense. I can totally see that. I would bet Amazon has similar statistics to that.
Yeah, I would imagine they would. In fact, I think I went to a talk somewhere that an Amazon engineer was giving, and they were talking about that and a few other things as far as how they handle their internal architecture, specifically, around those kind of things, and like how much money they lose when stuff goes down or when it's slow, and it's staggering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you're at the scale of these kinds of companies, if Google Shopping goes down for 10 minutes, that's millions and millions of dollars of lost revenue.
Yeah.
So with a progressive web app to have that offline capability, is it necessary for the user to download anything before being able to use it?
No. From users' perspective, PWA is really just a website that when you visit it, you don't even really know that it's a PWA. You just kind of go to it, you're using the site, not even really thinking about it. However, in the background, a progressive web app will use what's called the Service Worker API. It's a recent addition to the web specification, which allows them to register. It's effectively a client-side proxy, but this enables a website to work offline in the future. So if I then switch into airplane mode or lose my internet connection, I can go to that site again, and the service worker will cache a lot of all the resources necessary in order to render that site. And so the next time I go to it, it already has what it needs, and I'm able to immediately see it. And it does all of that in the background without me having to do anything or worry about anything. There's no download button. There's no extra functionality you need to worry about. It just does that all for you in the background.
Nice. So what does the browser and platform support look like as far as progressive web apps? Is it just one or two, or like how widespread can you expect to run this kind of stuff?
So because progressive web apps are really utilizing a bunch of different APIs that are been more or less recently introduced to web specification in the last few years, the browser support kind of varies depending on exactly which features you're trying to use. Service Worker is probably the most significant one, and that one is covered by pretty much everybody at this point. That's handled by Chrome, Firefox, Safari, works on Android and iOS. I think even Microsoft Edge has it. So pretty much everybody supports Service Worker, and so you can take advantage of the offline aspect of PWAs immediately on just about any platform. As you start to get to other APIs, things like WebRTC that allow you to capture photos and videos directly off the device, support there is a little bit less. Safari supports most of that spec, but there's a couple things in WebRTC that they don't, which make things a little annoying. There are some other things like add to home screen, which is an API that allows you to show a little pop-up that basically says, hey, you've come to our website 3 or 4 times. Maybe you want to add us to the home screen so you don't have to keep trying to type in our URL and try to get back to us. That's supported. That varies a little bit by platform. Android, that works out of the box. It just adds it to the home screen on your device. If you're on a Chromebook, then you can add it to your desktop as an icon. But Safari doesn't support this at all. There's no direct way for the device to do that, or for a web page to do that, I should say. So it does vary a little bit by platform. A lot of the major things are covered by everything, but as you get to the more recent APIs, the support does tend to vary a little bit by platform.
I had to use the Chrome on my iPhone to be able to use it. So I know, like, when I went to the event here in town, announcing it and telling us about it, they said that you guys were having some troubles with iOS devices. I take it from what you said that seems to be not the case anymore, but what troubles did you guys have with that?
Well, I won't say it's not the case anymore. We're still chugging through it. Hopefully soon. It's gotten a lot better. Still working through maybe the tail end of it, but the iOS is missing probably the most significant number of APIs. Back when I was in high school, as part of the Global Information Technology Academy, I did some web development back there, and we would always have pains with Internet Explorer and trying to get things to work on that. When it comes to mobile development today, I feel like it's really Safari that's the thing that becomes a pain. And so there are a number of APIs that just aren't quite fully supported. It also seems to have some issues with memory that we're still looking into. it seems to be using a lot more memory than it needs to. We're trying to reduce our memory usage and try to fix those kinds of things. That creates a very sluggish experience, and the page will crash sometimes and things like that. And that's incredibly annoying and incredibly painful to work with. Bulletin is such a media-intensive app. You take a lot of photos and videos with it, and that's really what causes a lot of these huge memory spikes. So we're still kind of working through those, but it's just specific to the use case that Bulletin is trying to do and the technologies that we're trying to use that have caused some of those issues with iOS in particular.
With that said, why would a person or company choose to build a PWA? Like, what kind of benefits can they expect?
So there are a few different advantages. Probably one of the more concrete ones is that your app is accessible by a single link, or just typing in the URL. Just basically that one click, you're immediately in the app, immediately there, seeing the home screen, having full access to what it's supposed to do. I've read a statistic somewhere that if you try to navigate somebody to a native app, to the Play Store or the App Store and ask them to download it, some 88% of users will back out of that download and won't do it because they don't want to download that directly onto the device, and it just takes too long. They don't want to deal with it. And so a huge number of users simply won't do it. Whereas a PWA will simply render immediately and you get instant access to the thing that you were trying to get to. So you're instantly there and you don't have to worry about downloading or any other layers of indirection to get to where you're trying to be. So that can have a huge benefit for increasing traffic and getting people to actually use your application. Another advantage can simply be if your company has a lot of web developers. If you have a lot of that background, you don't have to learn a whole new tech stack. That really depends on the existing state of what your company or your team happens to be. But because PWAs can emulate a lot of the features that native apps have traditionally had an advantage over in the past, you don't really need to relearn a whole new tech stack. You can just use these new APIs on your existing system or existing developer understanding of these features. One other advantage is simply that PWAs are a single code base that gets shared amongst all your different platforms, right? You can support, and like without PWAs, you'd have to have like an Android app, an iOS app, a Windows desktop, Mac desktop, Windows mobile if you really hate yourself. I used to do Windows mobile development, so I can make that joke.
I can laugh at it for the same reason. I did some Pocket PC stuff back in the day, so yeah.
Oh, so effectively, without a PWA, you're trying to build all these different code bases that are effectively doing the same thing, right? An Android app and an iOS are usually pretty equivalent in features, but you have to write everything twice because they're in two different languages. The PWA, however, is just the one website that gets rendered on both platforms, and you're able to present similar user experiences on both without having to rewrite everything from scratch. And you get a huge advantage from that. In the past, traditionally, you used tools like Cordova or PhoneGap. More recently, Electron, I think, is kind of taking over that space.
Yeah.
But those still have to deal with a lot of native integration. You get plugin issues. You're still generating native apps out of them, and that can add a lot of additional complexity. Whereas a PWA is just the pure web platform that it just runs directly as web, and you don't need to worry about any of that additional complexity, which can have a huge advantage. Lastly, probably my favorite feature, because I've done a lot of Android native app work in the past, is that by working in web, any updates that you add to your system just get immediately pushed out to all of your users. And they all immediately get access to whatever code changes you've made. For native apps, trying to release a new version is a massive pain, simply because users just don't update apps. There's a huge number of, because I used to work on the Google News and Weather Android app, and there's a huge number of users that are still using the version that was installed by default on their phone 4 years ago. And then they're finally feedback asking us to fix bugs, and I'm like, that was fixed 2 years ago. You never updated it.
Sounds like my mother.
I was just thinking, I'm looking at the version on mine. Yeah, I'll go back and look at that and feel bad probably, because I probably haven't updated either. Although I think I have it set to auto update, so maybe not.
But the thing is that becomes a really big problem from a development standpoint, because you have to support all these older versions. For instance, our server needs to work with older versions of the app that don't have additional fixes and changes that we've made. And the server has that code to handle those things, and we can't get rid of it. We can never improve that. It's just stuck there forever in a way that you can't change, because you can't get rid of old apps. Whereas with a website, you're updates just go immediately out, and you really don't need to worry about having old versions out and active anywhere. And that reduces the complexity and gives you a much quicker turnaround time. I think with the Android app, we would release maybe once a quarter, but with Bulletin, we release every week. That's a huge improvement. It makes things a lot easier when it comes to the continuous development of the app.
Yeah, those kind of continuous release cycles are nice. We've kind of talked about what a progressive web app is. Now, kind of getting into how to build one. Will and I are both .NET developers. I do some Angular when they let me touch the front end, and he does some Delphi.
I do web forms and MVC and web API and SQL Server and Delphi, and I'm all over the map.
Yeah. So what skill set is needed to develop a progressive web app, or what, I don't know, I guess, what frameworks or technologies can you use to build them?
So since PWAs are really just standard websites, they're just using more recent APIs in the spec to provide some of these nicer features. It's really just a standard web development skill set is all that's really needed. Simply understanding JavaScript and the browser, the DOM, that kind of thing. That's really all that you need to understand in order to be able to take advantage of a lot of these PWA features. Fundamentally, you can use pretty much any framework you want. If you wanted to turn Angular into a PWA, I'm sure it's possible. Admittedly, Angular is a little slow on startup from my understanding, so I don't know that you would do well at the speed tenet of PWA, but you can certainly give that a shot if you really wanted to.
A lot of things to load with Angular.
Yeah. At Bulletin, we use Polymer, which is a Google framework that's built around web components, and it works very well with being a PWA and taking advantage of a lot of these new APIs. Though fundamentally, you really can use whatever you want when it comes to that. The really important things in terms of skill set are just understanding the web development and front end space, and probably the one thing is making sure you verify that the API exists before you call it. That's a thing that's really important for a web developer that a lot of other disciplines don't really run into. I don't know how often you need to do that from a .NET point of view. It's been a while since I've done that.
Yeah, it kind of depends on how you're calling it, but yeah, we've got some tricks, I guess, to make it not painful. But you definitely, anytime you're in a disconnected scenario, you do have to be aware that could happen.
Well, we're calling .NET APIs from Angular applications on the front end, so it's fun.
Probably a couple layers of indirection there between those two components.
Yeah.
Yeah, like whereas mine is like, straight up Ajax calls from knockout JS code, straight to the back end. So I have to, basically, like if it goes wrong for me, I get a 404 and, I have to deal with that. But I don't really have to check to make sure that it's actually there, I guess. It just all breaks if it's not there.
Close enough, right? I mean,
Yeah.
So how would you provide custom features based on a progressive web app?
Well, I mean, because they're just standard websites in terms of providing custom features. I mean, it's really just a matter of utilizing the APIs that are in the spec to accomplish, to create this whatever tool or app that you want to build for it. For the case of Bulletin, we've got our primary use case is being able to capture photos and videos in order to tell the story about whatever local event you happen to be at. We're really just utilizing the WebRTC API in order to capture this media and storing it locally through an IndexedDB database, in case you're offline, things don't upload right away. And then effectively just uploading those to a server and being able to generate a public web page out of it. So it's really just composing those new progressive web app APIs and being able to use those to construct whatever feature it is that you're trying to create.
How do you test a PWA?
So it's at least pretty similar to the way most web apps work. I mean, you can use, whatever standard JavaScript testing framework you happen to use, and 90% of it's going to be the same as that. The tricky part for testing PWAs is when it comes to service worker and a lot of the reliability aspects of it. A lot of testing tools haven't quite caught up to this, and they don't have great ways of testing service worker, just because it's such a weird kind of client-side proxy that's not really directly loaded, and it runs in the background between multiple page loads. And so it's funky and a little weird to test. What you can do very easily is you can take a lot of the logic in your service worker, put that to a different file, and then just unit test that file independently of service worker. which can help things a lot, but it's still, you can need additional integration and end-to-end tests on top of that in order to verify that your service worker is really working correctly, that it's installing correctly and it's not running into errors or things like that. Integration tests can really be helpful with that. That's really kind of the biggest challenge for PWA in particular. Beyond that, the challenge of testing is really not that distinct from traditional web development, traditional unit and integration tests with JavaScript.
So what did your testing stack look like when you were building Bulletin?
So we use Polymer as our framework, as our UI framework for Bulletin. And Polymer includes Web Component Tester, which is a tool that they have that allows you to easily test individual Polymer components. You can, simulate button clicks and text entry and things like that, and verify that your component's behaving the way that you expect it to. That's built on top of Mocha, Sign-On, and Chai. It's really combining all those together with a few kind of helpful Polymer APIs for working with their web components. So that's the simple part of, at least for testing an individual Polymer component. For the JavaScript code that's not a part of Polymer, that's not UI dependent, we use JS Unit for that right now. I'm currently in the process of trying to migrate that to use Karma as our runner and make something a little bit more modern. But at least for right now, it's using JS Unit for unit testing that. And when it comes to integration tests, we use Selenium WebDriver for actually controlling the browser and verifying that everything is working correctly.
Very cool. I was wondering, just kind of what the stack looked like on that, because actually one of the few things I did get to do at Music City Tech as far as like going into a class and working on stuff, one was Electron, but the other one was using Jest for TDD in JavaScript, and that was a first for me doing TDD with it. So I was just kind of curious what you guys used on a larger production app.
Yeah, and I'm not too familiar with that test framework in particular, but we have lots of tests for these kinds of things just because it's such a big project. And at Google, we really prioritize making sure all the code is as tested as it reasonably can be. So there's a lot of that TDD mindset in the way that we build it.
We've been pushing a lot of the TDD where I work, and we're really good with our API side because it's kind of built in and it's real easy to write unit tests. And so we're trying, I know some of the senior and lead UI developers are trying to push everyone towards a testing mindset when it comes to the front end as well, because they've relied so heavily on QA to do their testing for them, that we're trying to get that done. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I've done a lot of front end work over the years, and if there's one thing I've learned, is that testing front end is not easy. Just trying to verify that views are rendering correctly and data is propagated correctly on so many different devices that you have to work with. It could be quite a challenge to really get solid tests that actually cover all of the different use cases, and it could be quite difficult to do that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We're looking at doing Selenium at work, just for running automated unit tests, and that is no joke. A lot of stuff to worry about. Just that part, just scripting stuff off enough where we can go, this thing doesn't blow up under the most common scenarios, much less like weird edge cases like Safari on an iPad 2 or something weird. So I definitely get where you're coming from on that one. Could you talk a little bit about how you use Polymer, especially like the web components in Bulletin?
So if you're not familiar with web components, the web component spec is effectively, it allows you to create your own kind of HTML tag. You can define your own tag, which has some JavaScript associated with it, and you can set attributes and things like that and be able to put content inside of it, and then this tag can be responsible for rendering that in a reasonable fashion. Polymer is really a polyfill for that kind of web component spec with some additional framework around it in order to make it easier to work with. But this effectively allows us to create components out of individual UI elements. We have one component that's our home screen that renders the title bar at the top and the app drawer that slides out from the side. But then it works with another component that actually renders an individual story. And it renders those in a giant list. And so each story is its own component that is responsible for rendering itself, with some inputs and outputs and that kind of thing. So it allows It allows us to really compartmentalize our view logic such that each view can be responsible for rendering itself, but also having certain inputs and outputs that allow it to integrate easily with other components, and then being able to compose them all together into a coherent UI without having a whole bunch of spaghetti code just trying to get things to display and render correctly. That's really the major advantage of Polymer web components, and that's what we use it for at Bulletin.
So how does that compare to like Angular components and the way those are built?
So I have done Angular. It was a long time ago. I don't remember too much of it, unfortunately. I remember kind of the module system and the $sign scope variable that never goes away. I don't remember too much about Angular in particular, but it's effectively what you're doing with Polymer is you're able to define a class which represents an HTML tag, and you're saying that this is responsible for rendering what that looks like underneath. And then you can compose other components inside of it and say that, this is a list of a bunch of stories, and then those stories are actually a bunch of images with some text under them and something like that. And you're able to compose them all together into this kind of fashion. For individuals who might be using React, which has been really popular lately, it's very similar to the components that React is able to create. And you can kind of easily compose them together and put them inside of each other and connect them all together in a useful fashion. And Polymer creates a very similar interface to the way that React works.
Sounds a lot like the way components are with Angular too, because I just remember I built our address component. Well, the original one, it's gone through several iterations since I built it when I was learning about components. And it was interesting because you just get this. I work for the state, and so we had like our state tag dash address. And so you just had this element that you could put in wherever you needed that, and it had, when you put it in there, it filled it with the HTML and all the JavaScript behind it. So I really like that concept.
Yeah, I use that a lot as well in Knockout. Because I've actually got the whole component bootstrapping stuff set up there. Of course, like you have to kind of hand roll a lot of that, with the older frameworks. So it like I'll just say that there was probably 4 or 5 beers consumed on a weekend when I got that working, because I wanted it and like didn't have time to do it on the clock. So I like spent my own time on it, and it was a lot cleaner, like looking at the way that was done in Polymer, because that's kind of laid out for you, whereas like I had to roll up all the required JS stuff and all the set up all the pathing and get it to where it could figure out what it was doing. I had to like fork a couple of components that we were using and actually like make a copy of them and make them where they would deal with the module pattern that it expected. It was all kinds of fun. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's nice to complain about it, but it would probably be better like in a real production setting to have something that kind of gets you into that position beforehand.
Yeah, Polymer really provides that as kind of the baseline, is where you start. The framework's able to handle, integrating all of the linking all the components together and loading them correctly. So it's really easy to be able to compose them in such a way. One of the examples we have is I have like a video player that's just responsible for playing a video. That's really all it does. But it takes as an input the URL for the video to play. And so it's got some JavaScript code that actually fetches the video and loads it and all that kind of stuff. But then with this one component, I'm able to insert that video in all the different places that we need to use it, and be able to play it correctly, and know that the code is going to be loaded where necessary, and it's going to be linked in correctly, and it'll be consistent across all of these different uses. And that's really where the power of web components comes in.
So are there any other features or elements of Polymer that we probably need to mention here?
The major thing is web components. There is a web component spec that has been approved by the specification committee, and so you can actually load a lot of the web component system without needing Polymer. What Polymer does is it polyfills that system for older browsers that may not support it, and it provides a data binding layer on top of this, so that you're able to bind the output of one component to the input of another. We use that to pass around our models a lot. as you're saying that the way Bulletin works, you're capturing a story about a specific event. We data bind that story. We have a story class which contains a lot of the information, and then we're able to data bind that and pass it around so that on the main screen we show a list of stories in like a simplified view, and then when you tap on one, it binds that to a separate full screen view that actually renders all the different media that you captured associated with that story. So we use data binding in order to accomplish a lot of that, and Polymer is the part that implements that. It does also have behaviors, which are effectively a form of mix-in. You're able to mix in behaviors directly into components without needing to worry about a complicated inheritance hierarchy or anything like that. So behaviors can be very useful there. Polymer also manages a lot of the underlying DOM APIs and the way that repainting works and that kind of stuff, and registering the actual web components, and handles events and targeting those events, things like that. So it provides a lot of the kind of lower level stuff that most application developers wouldn't want to worry about, is really what Polymer tries to provide. There are also a few helper utilities, things like a jQuery-like selector system in order to have a little bit more control over the web component, and you can dedo property changes if you get a bunch of them at once and things like that. So it's really there to simplify the web components API and make something really usable for an application developer that doesn't want to worry about a lot of the nitty-gritty low-level stuff.
Yeah, awesome. I'm going to have to share that with some of my coworkers that'll really love it.
Yeah, I tend to get kind of into the weeds on the low-level stuff, hence the Delphi development. But, for productivity, I probably would do something more like this. It's just I like to go get lost in stuff like debugging assembler.
It certainly doesn't stop you from doing that if you really want to. I don't know that I would recommend it, but you can if you really want to.
I don't know. It's entertaining to, kind of dig into all that kind of stuff. And speaking of stuff that is entertaining and low level and kind of difficult and nasty, can you explain a little bit more about how WebRTC works in here and how it was used to build Bulletin?
WebRTC is the API that we use that enables us to access the device's camera. We can take photos and videos directly from there, and that's the actual content that gets saved with the story and gets uploaded to servers and all that kind of stuff. This has actually been possible before WebRTC. There was an older API to do this, which we use on iOS because it can't fully support this. But what WebRTC really enables is that it gives us a direct access to the camera stream, which we can do whatever we want with. So we're able to display that directly in the page, and then we can build a UI on top of that. So we actually render what the camera is currently seeing directly in front of you, and then we put buttons on top of it in order to, take a photo or switch over to video mode and then capture a video, or switch out of it and go input some text, something like that. So we have full control over the UI. It's not like a dialogue system of request a photo and then it goes out to the camera. That's effectively what Safari does on its older system. But with WebRTC, we have full control over the UI. We're able to render that directly in line and present a much better UX that's not nearly as clunky, and it's much more streamlined in order to present the experience that we really want to for Bulletin. And that's where the major advantage of WebRTC comes from. We're able to control that whole UI and have a much finer grained integration with it than we've been able to in the past, and be much more similar to what native apps have been able to do with the camera previously.
Nice. Just out of curiosity, what does working with streams look like in client-side JavaScript? I mean, I do it all the time, server side, but I haven't done much on the JavaScript end. I mean, I've dealt with arrays and doing like BTOA and messing around with that kind of stuff. But
so fortunately, Polymer actually abstracts a lot of this away because they have components that handle a lot of this kind of thing. But effectively, what we do is we're able to get a stream from the device's camera, and we basically just kind of pipe it into another component that actually renders it and just displays it on the device. And then when the user taps the take photo button, there's simply a JavaScript function where we can, on the stream, where we can say, stream.takePhoto effectively. And then we get back a blob which contains the photo data from what you were, from whatever happened to be in that stream right at that moment. And similarly, we can record video from it by basically just saying stream.start recording and stream.stop recording. There's a little bit more to it than that. There's some other APIs that play into it. But at a fundamental and simple level, that's really what we're working with. And so it's actually a pretty straightforward UI, and Polymer abstracts away some of the the more lower level stuff like trying to render it in line directly in the page, Polymer does a lot of that for us. So the API is actually a lot cleaner than I really expected it to be, I think.
Yeah, I think I'll be probably like poking around in that code later, just because I gotta know.
Yeah, that sounds really fascinating. I'm thinking about one of the first things I worked on. Part of it involved taking pictures. It was a mobile app that involved taking pictures and then uploading them. Of course, I just worked on the API for it, but it probably would have gone a lot smoother with Polymer the way you're describing it, because that just sounds really interesting.
It was a lot less painful than I really expected it to be.
Yeah, because it sounds like something that would be just awful. That's why I was really intrigued, because it sounded kind of fun.
I am oversimplifying it a little bit. There are other things that go into it, but fundamentally, that's more or less the way it works.
Cool.
So we've talked about some of the fascinating and the interesting stuff, and you brought up Service Worker API, which I didn't even bring into the questions, but I couldn't think of any that you hadn't already answered whenever I came up with one. So that was awesome. One thing that we really are curious about is, what challenges did you face when building Bulletin as a progressive web app?
None, absolutely none. This project's been perfect from the start. Nothing's ever gone wrong. That's
every project manager's dream.
Yep, that's exactly how it happened. As much as I'd love to say that, that's definitely not accurate. So the biggest problem we've really had is probably performance and reliability. We've talked about before, particularly with iOS, where the memory usage is just not where it should be. We've had a lot of very janky UI on iOS and crashing. The page just dies. That's been a big challenge for us. We're still kind of working through the tail end of that. It's definitely improved a lot, but we still need to spend a bit more on that. But even beyond the iOS issues, performance and reliability covers a lot of different things, particularly because of what Bulletin is. We capture a lot of photos and videos. We have to deal with a lot of media. We have to upload them to a backend server, which actually renders them all as a separate web page. That means we have to deal with a lot of very large and complex data. And we have a very complicated syncing system in order to make sure that all content gets uploaded, because you could be on a flaky network, you could be offline. We may try to upload a video and then it disconnects halfway through and we need to resume it. That makes things quite complicated. We also need to clear out your local data after you've uploaded it, because we don't want to be wasting your device space, right? If you capture a big video, we don't want that just sitting on the device forever. We need to get rid of that once we have been able to upload it. And so working through those kinds of reliability and performance issues in order to make sure that the app is reliable enough that you're willing to be able to actually go and capture a story about, your kid's high school football game, is the example I brought up earlier, right? You want to be confident that Bulletin will actually work for this case. Things will actually upload correctly. The media will actually capture correctly, and it's not going to crash in the middle of it. So that's probably been our most significant challenge. The one other one I'll mention, which is just kind of a unique user interaction, is that users don't really understand what a PWA is, which is fine. PWA is kind of a technical thing, so I wouldn't expect a random user to understand that, to have heard that acronym or know what it is. The thing is, there are a lot of features that PWAs provide which users aren't really aware of. Things like just the offline access that Service Worker provides. If I was on a plane and didn't have an internet connection and I wanted to take a Bulletin story, I don't think it would occur to me to open Chrome and type in bulletin.app and expect to get something that works. And yet it totally does. So it's something that in our brains, we don't think of the web as working in that kind of offline way, despite the fact that it totally can work that way. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of users have kind of run into some issues with those kinds of things. They don't entirely understand that. We had a lot of issues with the URL early on. We didn't have bulletin.app. We actually had a much more complex URL that users were having trouble remembering and trying to get back to. And so having a short and memorable URL like bulletin.app has been really helpful for us.
Yeah, when I first started using it, I had to Google Bulletin to get to it.
That's a terrible user experience to get there, but I definitely don't blame you.
Well, on the plus side, you at least had a way to search for it.
That's true.
That helped.
I mean, like it would be real bad if it didn't show up in Google. then I don't know what you do then.
The problem is there's a lot of like help pages and things like that. We have the landing page that like explains what Bulletin is. There's a lot of other stuff that's not Bulletin, but also shows up when you Google it, which makes things kind of complicated. And it's especially annoying with autocomplete because you'd expect like after you've been there a couple times, you'd expect to just type like BUL and hit enter and just suddenly end up there. But usually that's not the case. Usually you end up at like a story that you've made in the past or like the landing page or something. But now with bulletin.app, that pretty much happens right off the bat, which makes things a lot better.
I have to start using that because every time I go to it now, I get the sign up for it. And I'm like, but I've already signed up.
Yeah.
And then I have to scroll down.
See,
then I find the problem. The sign in.
That's exactly the problem, which makes things very annoying. But we only launched Bulletin.app, I think, last week or early last week. So it's pretty new. It's probably why you weren't familiar with it. But I definitely recommend going through that. It's much nicer and a lot easier.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to use that. That sounds awesome.
So I think the takeaway is that if you're making a progressive web app, make sure you have a good URL and you host it at the right spot.
Yeah, very, very true. We got our podcast name because the URL was available.
Yep. And it's weird, like, you know, because we came up with the name and then the concept just sort of almost filtered down from the name. You know, if you look at it, it was really, really organic the way that happened because it was complete developer podcast. And then, you know, a year or two in, we're like, you know, we're really trying to make developers into complete human beings that have like, they're well-rounded. You know, I guess it was just one of those weird, you know, twists of fate. I mean, it works. So
yeah, it just fell into place for us. So I completely agree with you though. You know, get your web address because that's a big thing for people.
Yeah, we should have named it Two Rich Dudes and then put that in place.
True. That would be great. I like that idea.
Because it wouldn't have been true at the start. It's not now either, but that would have been a good way to go.
I don't know. Given our luck, it would be like what happened to our with our email address, which is neckbeards.
Yeah, the neckbeards.
And neither one of us has a neckbeard anymore.
That one didn't come true.
Yeah.
Guys, progressive web apps are a new way of combining web technology with a mobile-first mindset. They allow you to build one site that runs like a native app on multiple devices. We want to thank Doug for coming on the show and talking to us about progressive web apps and how he's built one for Google. We both learned a lot. I know I'm going to be looking a lot more into service workers now, so thank you very much for that. Doug, how can people find out more about Google Bulletin and progressive web apps in general?
So I've already mentioned the bulletin.app URL. I think we talked about that a lot. That's really to get to the actual app. You can also do google.com/bulletin. That's more of an informational, explaining what it is and the sign up process and that kind of thing. The page you kept hitting when you didn't want to hit that. But if you're trying to learn more about Bulletin, then that is the page that you probably want to go to. When it comes to learning more about progressive web apps, Google has been pushing for those since their inception. And so on the Google developers website, developers.google.com, there's a lot of stuff on progressive web apps, and that could be really helpful. When I was first getting ramped up on this, I looked a lot into that. There's a lot of very useful videos from Google I.O. and from the Polymer team and things like that talk about a lot of these aspects of PWAs. So I definitely recommend those.
Awesome. Thank you again for coming on the show. That pretty much wraps us up. Before we close everything out, Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
Well, I just want to point out something that I really noticed in this discussion. You know, it's like, you know, you've got all the Polymer stuff and then progressive web apps and just how cool that is. But if you notice, all the stuff in there that was cool was designed to meet a business need. You know, the disconnected app stuff, all the, you know, use of the service workers, all that kind of stuff was set up to win at business. And I just want to point that out. Like, if you're trying to build something cool, find a business case for it first. It makes it a lot easier to actually get away with it. And I don't want to add too much more to that other than just approach it that way. So that's all I got.
Stand by for Titanfall.
If you have a question or comment, please email us at neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed through Creative Commons.
The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up for weekly emails with extra tips and insights, be sure to check out the website at CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with news about the show. Catch us each week as we broadcast live, talking about what's going on in the tech world and answering listener questions.
Learn more about all of our shows and groups by going to CompleteDeveloperNetwork.com, where you'll find links to Junior Developer Toolbox, Developer Launchpad, and our other communities. Thanks for listening. See you next time.